Okay, so yes, welcome to this webinar this morning, an introduction to baseline assessment, or well, it's morning here in the UK. I'm not sure what time it is wherever you're listening from. So just a couple of quick housekeeping. We can't hear any members of the audience. You're all on mute at the moment, and this is to make sure that the quality of the audio is good throughout. If you would like to ask questions, please post them in the questions section located on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll answer all questions, or as many as we can, at the end of the webinar. You will receive a certificate of attendance sent to your email inbox about 1 hour after the webinar ends, and you will receive a copy of the webinar recording and the slides sent via email next week. I'm going to hand over now to our presenter, Mark Frazer.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you're joining us from. As Caroline said, it's very early and dark and cold in the morning here in the UK, so I hope it's a bit nicer where you are. Just as very quickly as a quick introduction about myself, my name is Mark Frazer. I'm the Teaching and Learning Lead at the Cambridge Centre for Evaluation and Monitoring. I've been here since about 2015, so 7 years. And prior to that, I was a primary school teacher and head teacher in 3 schools in and around the area where I'm based here in northeast England. And moving on, just today, we're going to have a think about what baseline assessment is. It's a term we hear a lot, but I'm hoping maybe just to clarify exactly what we mean at CEM when we talk about baseline assessment. I'll show you quite a variety of the kinds of information that a baseline assessment can provide you with, using some of our reports from our assessments as examples, and then tell you a little bit more about our assessments themselves. And finally, we'll round off by taking questions from the audience. So if you've got anything that you'd like to ask about, as Caroline said earlier on, please drop your question into the chat. And at the end of the presentation, we will try and answer as many as we can. If we can't answer your questions straight away, we'll follow up with an email response or some frequently asked questions that come out with the slides. So first of all, let's have just a very quick think about what a baseline assessment is. When I was thinking about putting the slides together for this presentation, I was trying to think about all of the different uses and purposes of assessment, and thinking from the point of view that we often think about this in Chem. We have a variety of purposes that we have products which students around the world use, and these are maybe the 5 key areas, the 5 main purposes of assessment. And you're probably familiar with formative and summative assessment in terms of, that's assessment for learning and assessment of learning. But just moving to the next slide, Caroline, just today I'd like to focus on baseline assessment, which is actually assessment before learning. So that's helping you to answer the question, where am I now, or where are my students now? And then in the grey boxes down at the bottom, I will kind of touch on some of these things later on as well. Chem systems allow, from a baseline measure, from an initial measure, to do a variety of things, including predicting the future outcomes, and also allowing you to look back and evaluate how your teaching has gone in your school or your college or your setting, and what difference has it made. So how did all of your students perform? So we've got an initial measure from which we can look forwards, but also look back. Next slide, please. So talking about baseline, as I said, an initial measure. So this is about making a good start. Teachers quite often need valuable information about their students, particularly when they're unfamiliar with them. And again, 2 examples here where that might be the case, where information is really needed in order for you to quickly develop an understanding of what your students know and can do. And when you're either at the start of a primary school, for example, where you're bringing children in from, for example, nursery settings, or further up the age range in secondary schools, where maybe children or students are entering from a variety of different primary schools. The type of information that you have will vary immensely. Each setting probably has its own way of doing things. So a really good idea is to, once you have all of your students together at the start of a new school year, perhaps, take a baseline measure. So what do I mean by that? So moving on to the next slide. So establishing this baseline, this is a reference point. Three main reasons for doing this. So briefly referred to a few of these things already, but I'll just spend another minute or so just thinking about this. As a teacher, as a school leader, you need to quickly develop a comprehensive overview of what your new students can do in key areas of learning. You might not have any information about any of your students who are joining you, so we need a quick and efficient way of establishing that. This is an evidence base that you can then use for grouping and supporting learners according to their developmental needs. And then, as mentioned before, unless you know where you have started from, it's going to be very difficult to predict ahead as to how your students may do, or to look back at the end of the course and work out how well your students have done individually, but also how your institution has performed overall with that cohort of students. So without this baseline, various onward types of measurement are going to be quite difficult. So as well as finding out from the formal assessment, and I'm thinking particularly about younger children here, one of our systems, BASE, is administered one-to-one. So you'd have an adult, a teacher, or a learning support assistant working at a computer with one student at a time. And as well as all of the information that we are measuring about early literacy, early mathematics, their non-verbal skills perhaps, it's also really revealing just to sit for 20 minutes, 30 minutes with a very young student and just watch what they're doing. It's a great way of gathering this wealth of additional information that I've referred to here as soft information. Things like how methodically a child approaches the tasks that they're presented with, the little problems, the little activities, and the little questions that appear on screen. How do they go about answering them? Is there quite a structured approach, or maybe, which would be quite revealing, is the child maybe struggling to access this? So whichever way it turns out, that's really valuable background information. And I think particularly young children, when they're coming into a new setting, the third point here, this is a great way of spending a bit of time with them so that they can become comfortable with you or your colleagues and their new surroundings. Next slide. So I'm going to have a few minutes now where we just look through some of the different types of reports that KEM assessments provide. So we have a basic assessment, which on screen typically, this is a computer-based assessment, and we have a variety of questions starting from kind of a storybook kind of approach for the young children. And we're asking simple things about, do they recognize the letters of the alphabet? Can they attempt to read very simple words? Can they count? Can they recognize the digits? Can they read digits as numbers? Can they compare the size of things? All of these really simple, basic concepts with young children, up to far more challenging mathematics and reading activities for the older children. So in KEM, we span the age range from 3 to 18. So we have a family of assessments which produce assessment information. And I'm not really going to think about the assessments themselves, but we can talk to you separately if you'd like to know a little bit more about them. And at the very end, I'll show you just a summary of the kinds of things that we are measuring in our assessments. But the purpose of this session is to look at the kind of information we're getting from the assessments. And this bar, what we call the arrow graph here, is from our baseline for very young children. And as you can see, we've got some information near the top telling us a little bit about the child. So SOY is short for start of year, when the first baseline assessment takes place, and EOY, this is the end of year. And you'll notice that there are no numerical scores or any data really of any assessment activity on this report. This is purely a graphical representation of how the child has done at the start of year. So we have a learning progression, if you like, up the arrow, starting with the most basic skills. And I apologize, you probably can't read this, but when you get the slides later on, you can have a look in more detail. But we've got little learning statements, and the theory is that the child will start somewhere near the bottom of the arrow and move up as the year goes on. So we take the baseline measure at the start of year, then we have a follow-up assessment at the end of year. And the blue bars on the arrow kind of mark that point, start of year, end of year, and you can infer from the gap how much progress has been made. This is a UK example here, and you can see we've got the UK national standardization marked on, and that's just general background information, just so that you can see how a student came in. So in base, the child will work through the literacy and the mathematics activities with the teacher, but the personal, social, and emotional development, that's like a teacher conducted questionnaire. So again, graphical information from a baseline assessment there. So that's the first example. Moving to the next slide, we will see this is from a system we have called Incus. This is for primary children. And this is just a little bit more sophisticated in terms of the data that it's providing. Incus is quite special in the sense that we have standardized scores within it, but we can also provide age equivalent scores. So we know if a student takes this assessment at the start of maybe the school year or a particular phase within your school, we know that roughly, if we standardize the scores, the average score is 100. And we have a system of converting that into a general age expectation as well, a little bit like you would have in certain types of reading tests, perhaps, that you're maybe more familiar with. So from this, the data is also represented graphically. You can see the little dots, and again, I apologize for the tiny writing, but along the x-axis there, they're the different sections of the assessment. The red dotted line is the expectation, the mean, the average, if you like. Got to be quite precise with what we mean by expectation, and it's just typical distribution of scores and the average score being in the middle. And this is based on thousands of students who've taken this assessment over the years. The little bars on this particular graph show that there's a little bit of uncertainty, and generally, because our assessments are computer driven and because they are adaptive, that means each child will see, or each student will see, a different set of questions depending on their ability. The program chooses the question depending on their previous response. And if there's a lot of guessing going on, those error bars, that uncertainty, they grow. So if you see a circle with a very short set of bars on, that means we're fairly certain that that was quite consistently answered. The error bars are a little bit longer. We're not quite so sure that the student was answering in a consistent manner. So again, lots of information from this baseline assessment, which allows you to see where they are, how certain we are about that information, and how the different areas of the assessment compare to one another. For instance, for this student, you can see in vocabulary, in mathematics, and in the skills, and generally overall, they're quite well above average, moving up to the sort of the more able bracket. But in terms of their non-verbal skills, they are actually sort of very much in line with sort of the average attainment of the cohort. Moving on, we've got different types of reports. If we just have a look at how we represent these graphically. Again, I don't expect you to kind of infer much from these, but we are just able to show if we carry out a baseline and then follow up that measure, you can see where you started and where you ended. So that's retrospective information. So you can see the top left-hand graph, for example, there, this is an individual student who started off at about the age of 6.5 and was assessed 5 times. You can see the diamonds there. And the green line is the sort of typical attainment. So they've done really quite well over time. Some of the other graphs show groups and cohorts of students who've maybe not performed quite so well. So that's looking back. And then looking forwards, we have the ability to, particularly with the secondary systems, you can see the colorful bar graph on the right-hand side there, depending on how the student performed in the baseline assessment. Chem is fairly unique in that we have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of students now who have taken our assessments, and we know their eventual outcomes in GCSE, IGCSE, IB, A-levels, all the different qualifications that you're likely to find in English medium schools internationally, and certainly schools that follow any kind of UK-based curriculum. So this is a general predictor so that we know if a student attained a particular mark, what that likely outcome might be at the end of the course. And this is purely statistical. We just know that if you scored, I don't know, 105, for instance, on a standardized score, what would that likely outcome be in a range of subjects at the end of GCSE? Moving on to the next slide, I think that shows we've got a wealth of, as well as the predictions. I'm going to come back to the sort of the prediction thing in a moment, but we have, again, you'll see on slides more in more detail, scores for individual students and for groups of students, and how your students have performed in relation to others. So that's the first half of that page, and then the menu, yep, there's lots of reports there. So the secondary system contains a wealth of reports looking at all sorts of different aspects of your students and establishment as a whole. And I'm just going to return to the next slide. We will see what I was talking about in terms of predictions, and this is thinking about older students and how they may do based on a baseline score. So in our secondary plus reporting, we have this graph, and the green arrow on the left-hand side represents the student's individual score in the Chem baseline assessment. You can see there's the little orange arrowhead, which is pointing there to 120, so they've done quite well. So they're comfortably above the mean, above the average. So they've got a score, a standardized score of 120. So what does that actually mean? So the blue arrows, and again, there's tiny little writing at the bottom, which I'm sure you probably can't read on here, but once the slides come, hopefully you can look to see in more detail. Each of the blue arrows represents a different subject at GCSE in this particular case. And the different grades starting, the lowest sort of U up to 9. So we know that a student who gets a score of 120, because we take that baseline measure and then we gather in a couple of years, maybe 3 years, 2 years later, their actual outcomes, what would that translate to in the different grades in the different subjects? You can see in art and design, that student is likely to get a grade between 6 and 7. In biology, they may be hovering between a 7 and an 8. Likewise in the next one, which is chemistry, and so on. And a lot of teachers look at this and think, actually, this is quite interesting. Just, if nothing else, it's a prediction. You must always remember it's a prediction. It's not a guaranteed outcome. So the likelihood of getting each grade is expressed as a percentage. So that's what you can see. We've got the grade, and then we've got the percentage chance, the likelihood of attaining each of these grades. And there are lots, you can scroll on the actual live report. This scrolls backwards and forwards, so you can see a number of different subjects. This might be useful because once you've taken your baseline measure, you might then want to think about, well, which subjects is it best for my students to choose to study? Which courses should they follow? And again, we always caution any kind of decisions around life-changing decisions perhaps as to which courses you choose. We temper that by saying, remember, one assessment point is not sufficient. So you've got to maybe take our information from a chem assessment, but also use it alongside all of the information that you hold in school. You know about the students' attitude, their dispositions, the type of work they normally produce. You have a historical record, perhaps, of the work that they have produced in various years beforehand, what we would call learning artifacts. They may be exercise books, they may be project submissions, they could be, I don't know, art and design, for example, more creative pieces that students have produced in the recent past. And you gather all of this information together, and we hope that our reports can help you have a more holistic view of how students are performing now, what information that they can provide you with through our assessment to support their onward development, but also looking further ahead, what the likely outcomes are at the end of a particular course. And moving on to the next slide, Caroline, so you've just seen a single student, but we also provide cohort profiles. So for instance, in your school, your setting, this is the typical of all the students who've taken the baseline assessment. We are estimating that this curve that you see here is the likely distribution of grades in a particular subject. So this is, again, art and design on a 9-to-1 scale. And you can see that the majority, the most frequently predicted grades are grades 7 and 6. And as you'd expect, that's kind of tails off at either side, but we do have a skew in this particular case where we think that there are quite a lot of children or students who, with the right guidance and the right support, potentially you can see quite a large proportion of them attaining the top grades. And moving on to the next section. So that was just a glimpse at some of our reports. So I'm just going to think a little bit more about chem products, CEM products, and just think about the kinds of things that you could use if you'd like us to chat to you about our systems in a little bit more detail outside of this presentation. So we believe that we can provide a suite of, well, we have an extensive suite, which I'll show you in a moment, of products and assessments for various age ranges, which help you to understand the core skills. The way the assessments are written, they're curriculum free, so they're not attached to a specific curriculum, but they look at common skills that students around the world use and need in order to succeed, generally in the key areas of mathematics and literacy, English, or English medium assessments, and also for some of our older children, excuse me, a sip of water, beg your pardon, we have non-verbal skills. And again, as mentioned, they're all computer-based and adaptive. So that means we ask a series of questions, and depending on the answers the students respond with, they might be presented with an easier question if they've failed to answer correctly, or a more challenging question if they have answered correctly. And generally, the challenge increases as the students move through the assessment. And then we know once they start providing a series of incorrect responses, that's about as far as that student can go in a particular area of the curriculum. So the assessment generally ends and it moves to a different section perhaps. So we do that with most of our assessments. For the younger children, it's not quite as sophisticated as that. We have a linear series of questions. And again, it depends on correct responses. But in order to make the assessment as short as possible and not to demoralize students by a negative experience, we want the sections to suit their abilities and their levels of understanding. So whichever algorithm we use, we believe that that provides students with a unique and bespoke experience which suits their developmental needs, and then provides teachers and school leaders with more information. In secondary, as mentioned before, we're not just looking at those key skills, but we're having a look further down the line as well into what that baseline score means in terms of potential future examination outcomes. So moving on, this is the family, if you like, of CEM assessments. So we start off with aspects, the green block on the left there, that's for very young children. That's for children in what we would say kindergarten or nursery, general or preschool provision, sometimes it's referred to. And also it has a similar but more challenging assessment for slightly older children in that phase called BASE. So they're the two early years assessments, and they are driven by the teacher sitting with the child. So this is not a measure of the students' IT skills, their computing skills. This is about asking the children in a storybook kind of way questions about early literacy and mathematics. When we move into the primary phase, into the orange colored block there in the middle for Incus, this is our main primary assessment for children between the ages of 5 and 11. And at this point, we are expecting that children are able to respond very simply on a computer screen by themselves. So they hear an audio track. They're not listening to a teacher. They're listening to through headphones generally, maybe because they're sitting next to other children. And remember, each child will be provided with a different set of questions. So it's quite important that the child is focusing on what they are being asked, not what their neighbor is being asked. And again, quite a comprehensive selection of curriculum elements, which I've got some slides which are right at the end of this presentation. I'm not going to talk in any great detail about what's in each assessment specifically, but once you receive the slides, you can have a look through and you can see what's there. And of course, you can always visit our website or talk to one of my colleagues for even more detailed information about what these assessments can offer you and what they include. Moving on to the secondary phase, we have MIDIUS and YELIS. So MIDIUS is the middle years information system, and that's for students between the ages of 11 and 14, just starting that secondary phase. So that's a great way when students are coming into your school of benchmarking at that early point, early stage in the first few weeks or the first few months of time in your setting, so that you can see where they're starting from. There is a follow-up assessment that can be taken. Well, you can use this assessment multiple times. You can use it, on an annual basis. YELIS, which is the year 11 system, that's the second part, the second half of the phase of the secondary phase. That's just it's a little bit more sophisticated. Obviously, because it's adaptive, that contains slightly more challenging content, but you're sort of looking forward over a shorter period, if you like. So the predictions, understandably, tend to be even more accurate from YELIS because we have a better understanding of what that student can do closer to the examination point at the end of the course. And then finally, in the age range, we have ALICE, the A-level information system, or the CEM International Baccalaureate version of the assessment, where students can take the assessment, again, as a baseline measure, and we're predominantly looking forward from that point to likely outcomes at the end of the course. The second benefit of ALICE as well is if you have IGCSE, GCSE, O-level data already, you can actually just input that data in and base predictions on that alone, without actually having to take the baseline assessment, or you could use a combination of the two. But typically, these are used annually, all of these assessments, with the exception of BASE, which we have a function to use at the start and end of year. But generally, most of our schools who use these tend to use them probably towards the start of a year, start of a phase, and use that as your baseline measure. So where am I, and where are my students at the start of the course? And moving on, this is just a comparison here as to how our phases and our different assessments align with the broader Cambridge pathway offering. So you can see Cambridge Primary, that's predominantly, well, aspects I mentioned before comes a little bit before that, but we're working towards including that for the very youngest children. But predominantly, BASE and Incus align with Cambridge Primary. Midges aligns with Cambridge Lower Secondary, Yellis with Cambridge Upper Secondary, and then Alice and Cambridge IBE, Cambridge Chem IBE, that aligns with the Cambridge Advanced phase of the pathway. Again, lots of text to take in there. Please don't worry about not being able to read them. The slides will make all that clear when you receive them. So just moving on, if Caroline's able just to flick through the little animation here, we've got typically what Cambridge Chem or Cambridge CEM gives me information about. We have generally reading and vocabulary, mathematics and non-verbal as the core elements of our assessments. Reading and vocabulary, we are looking at passages of text from very, very simple words to start off with, even just letter recognition for the youngest children, and working out what their English vocabulary is, because that is an excellent predictor of later attainment. Children who have good vocabulary scores tend to go on and do very well in all elements of the later, their academic career. Chem is built, or Cambridge CEM as it now is, started off as the Centre for Evaluation and Monitoring in Newcastle University before moving to Durham University, where it was for about 30 years, and then about 3 years ago to Cambridge University. And we have, underpinning all of our assessments, a wealth of academic research which links these key areas of early and further learning with ability, aptitude, and later academic success. And again, it's probably the subject of another presentation, but we can talk, if you're interested in it, in the sort of the research pedigree that our assessments are built on. But you can see on this slide, we start off with aspects and we move all the way through to Alice, and we have a slightly different set of measures at each point, but they tend to come back to those three areas that you see at the top: the reading and vocabulary, the mathematics, and the non-verbal reasoning. Non-verbal reasoning tends to be shape and space type problems. But again, we're not really here to talk about the assessments themselves. It was more to do with the philosophy behind baseline assessment. I'm sure we'll be doing other webinars where we'll be looking in greater detail at the contents of the assessments as well. And as we move towards the end of the presentation, I'd just like to think about the so what element of this. You've taken an assessment. What do you then do with that information? So as mentioned, baseline at the start of a course or the start of a student's journey through a particular part of school or a phase. So that's the assessment. So we gather that information. So our advice is to assess as early and with as much focus as possible. And then you use that information as soon as possible. Again, there's lots of research out there that says that you've got to take that information and use it straight away. When I was in school, I was always very, very keen that assessments were taken very seriously for a number of reasons. Not least because we had a phrase in English that was called shelfware, that you take an assessment, you very diligently print out all of the students' results, you put them in a file, and then you place that file on a shelf. And if you do that, it's of very little benefit at all. That information that you gather needs to be looked at by the teachers, by the school management, and by the whole school community in many ways. And that's the analyze part of it. That's the second phase that quite often is overlooked. So we've seen this information. What are we going to make from that? What can we infer from that information? Can we see likely future outcomes? Can we identify groups and clusters of students and use that baseline data to arrange our teaching groups in the most effective way possible? And also, very, very importantly, can we use that information to identify those students who are most at risk of disengaging? As we know, if students are not committed to their learning and are not diligent in their studies, then that can lead to a greatly increased risk of them falling behind and ultimately not attaining in line with their potential. So it's about identifying groups who need to be pushed and challenged, but also students who form those groups lower down the ability range who just need that support and that care in order to attain in line with expectation. So that's about acting, isn't it? So we've got that information, we've identified the groups, what are we going to do? That's the third stage here. So acting, what does that mean? So we've decided that we've got certain groups of students. So now we need to plan accordingly. We need to put those students into groups and support their individual needs through careful lesson planning. Our assessments can show gaps in knowledge and understanding at a fairly fine-grained level, especially with the younger children, down to individual questions. And then as a school, or as a college, or as a setting, you need to decide how you are best going to allocate your resources. Now that could be human resources, that's teachers and learning support assistants, or it could be, I don't know, computer support materials, written, paper intervention resources. From a creative point of view, this could be, extra time with, in art departments, or whatever aspect it is that you reveal, then you know your students best. You've got to think about how to best support them. And at the end there, that word, that differentiation, it's when I was trying to be a teacher, and I first heard about differentiation, it seemed fairly straightforward, and okay, we need to teach in according to those individual students' needs. But unless you have carried out some kind of baseline assessment when those students are new to you, how on earth do you know what the needs are for those learners? And if you don't know that, you can't differentiate. You can't provide that bespoke, that individual support that students need. And from the insight that you would gather from assessing using a baseline assessment, whether it's a chem system or somebody else's product as well, or maybe you have a system of your own in school, unless you are taking that measure, thinking about the information it's giving you, and then acting, doing something about it, your students will not move on. So hopefully that's a very simple and very sort of generalized way of dealing with the the data that you gather. What can I do with that information? And here, is a little model that we think might be useful in your school or college or early years setting. Again, fairly universal and could be used in many, many different situations and scenarios. So I think we've got a few minutes now to talk about, or try and answer some of your questions. But if you'd like to know more about Cambridge CEM, there's our website address there, cem.org. We also have a blog page on our site with lots of different articles about all manner of assessment problems and aspects and bits of advice out there as well. So I would suggest if you're looking for general assessment advice, that's a great place to start. Just before we do come back with questions, just going to skip through a few of these slides and just show you, Caroline's just going to quickly flick through, please. You can see for each of the assessments I've talked about, there's an example of a question and some basic information, some very simplified sort of summaries of what each assessment does. Again, not pretending you've got the eyesight or the time to read that now. But when the slides come, you can see that these are there at the end of the pack and you can refer back to them. Or, as mentioned, please visit our website and have a look. And if the information that you need is not there, contact us and one of my colleagues will be very, very happy to talk to you. So I think that's my presentation over. Thank you so much for listening. And I think Caroline now is going to help me with the questions, and we will see if there are any questions, can we provide some quick answers?
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Mark. It's really interesting. I think we do have quite a few questions here. So we'll just try and get through as many as we can. And then we don't manage to answer, we will include in our follow-up emails to you. So the first question is from April. To know how to interact with this, will we receive the PowerPoint or any other recording? Yes, you'll receive both the slides and a video recording of the entire presentation, which you're more than welcome to share with any of your colleagues. We have a question here again from April. Is Incus designed to be screening or diagnostic, Mark?
Right. Well, we're very careful about the word diagnostic in terms of that we are not in any of our assessments pointing to specific learning needs as such. So that's diagnostic has a slight sort of clinical implication to it when we use it. So we're not using this as any kind of tool to diagnose anything like, say, dyslexia or dyscalculia. But what we hope it does is shine a spotlight on particular areas of strength for individual students, but also developmental needs as well. So suppose it's diagnostic in the sense that it's identifying gaps, but not specific conditions. So just want to be very clear about that. And then, so that's screening, I suppose, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that word, but does that mean that we can put students in a kind of order of ability and divide them into groups according to their individual needs? Well, yes, you could use it for that as well. So it's quite a versatile tool for looking at general performance in an assessment and being able to sort your students out accordingly into groups according to their need. But also, when you drill down through the reports, there's quite some detail in Incus reports in particular that allows you to look in great detail at the different substrands of the assessment and identify not just that there may be a concern around literacy, but you can maybe have a look at actually it's word decoding that's the problem here, and is that maybe because the student doesn't have those phonics skills yet? Again, we're not pointing to a very specific cause, but we are maybe highlighting areas of concern or areas for further investigation.
Thanks, Mark. We have another question here from Scott Moore, who asks, why or how are the products that Chem offer better at predicting IGCSE and A-level outcomes than the products offered by other competitors such as GL?
Well, I think two reasons. I think we've got a much longer pedigree of doing this. As mentioned, I think Alice in particular started off as a project in just over the river from where I'm sitting here at Newcastle University almost 40 years ago, I believe, as a project, something called Coons, which then transformed into Alice. And we've got, as I mentioned, data from probably by now, hundreds of thousands of students who've taken our baseline assessment, and then we know the outcomes for. We are very cautious and careful as well. And I know sometimes when you look at other systems, that the predictions can be a little bit more optimistic. But I think we have a degree of caution that we would advise whenever we take, because basically this is based on one assessment point. We've always got to be very, very careful about that. And erring on the side of caution, I think, is sometimes a little bit more sensible rather than being kind of unreasonably optimistic. So our predictions may appear slightly lower, but that's because we know if a student, for example, does particularly well in the baseline assessment or has performed well in GCSE, that's not a guarantee that they will come out with an A or A star or whatever the grade is in the system we're talking about. And we always think, or we always advise, that whenever you use our system's information, the information that you get from our reports, that's used alongside the other information that you hold in your school or college. As mentioned, it could be learning artifacts, from exercise books, presentations, projects that the students have produced, the conversations that you have with them, your everyday observations, all of that must form a holistic view. But we believe we've got, a very well established, very credible, massive body of evidence which predicts to further outcomes in courses of various types.
Thank you, Mark. So we have a question from Senchoi Liu, who says, where can we teachers have access to these data for our own school? I guess that's a product question. We'll be sending everyone a follow-up email after this webinar, and we will include a link for you to fill out an expression of interest form, so that one of our team members can get in touch with you and talk about what kind of products you might need for your school. Is that about right, Mark?
Yes, that would be, of course, yes. And as mentioned before, if the information that you require is not there, please just contact us. We'd be very happy to talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question here from Sastri. Number one, is there any supportive material for preparation for the assessment? And number two, is this the first time that the chem is being introduced?
No, well, I'll answer the second part of that question first. No, the chem is a very well established part of the sort of the assessment landscape, really. As I referred to a little while ago, it's almost 40 years old. The bulk of its life was spent within Durham University, and we moved 3 years ago to Cambridge University. So it's quite a tried and tested suite of products. And secondly, we would caution against over familiarization with this, because this is meant to be a fair and objective exercise. And we're quite keen that all students kind of come, certainly from your setting, come to it with the same level of experience and understanding of the system as a whole, just so it's as fair an experience as possible. It's quite easy for students just to sit down, never having seen a chem assessment before, because there are example questions at the start of each section, which just explain the process or the method of response that's required. Something that assessment people tend to call paradigms. The style of the question is explained to the student before they actually embark on the live material, if you like. But on our website and in some of our documentation, we have examples of what the responses look like. Typically, as mentioned before, these are computer-based assessments with multiple choice responses. Sometimes it's free text entry where students have to type in a particular answer, or for the very young children, it's just a very simple yes and no response that the teacher discreetly operates to one side. So we don't believe that there needs to be a great deal of familiarization other than what's already included within the products themselves.
Great, thanks, Mark. So we have another question here. BASE and Incus then are the only assessments available in lower primary from Cambridge?
Sorry, that's yes. I mean, that's a general statement, I think, rather than a question. But we have, from computer-based assessments, we have, that's if we're just talking about computer-based assessments, we've got aspects, BASE, so aspects and BASE for early years children, and then Incus for the primary phase. And there are, in wider Cambridge, I think Checkpoint as well, and other paper-based assessments which fit in with early years, with primary children. But as far as I know, our offering is the core of the computer-based assessment. If you're in India, I know we have a very specific product called Check Together, which is a variation on BASE, which is again computer driven, but very specifically tied into the Early Years India project.
Thank you. I think we've just got time for one more question. So for students with disabilities, do you give the baseline assessments with accommodations? And if so, which ones may or may not be appropriate?
In terms of disabilities, it depends what we mean by disability. The only affordance that we offer routinely is additional time. So there are boxes where, when you are filling the admin details in, it's possible to allocate 25% extra time for students. We do not provide anything more than that at the moment, but we are looking into the ways of improving visualizations, and whether that's magnifiers and screen readers. All of those modern technological sort of possibilities are being sort of looked at the moment, but at the moment it's a very standardized system, other than the additional time.
Thanks, Mark. I'll just ask one more question because it's quite relevant for this audience of international schools. It's from Wenyi Chu, and they say, hello, I work at an international school and there are students whose first language is not English, and most of the time English is a foreign language learner. I'm wondering if the baseline assessments are still applicable to them as the test is in English, and how to interpret their marks. Thanks for the advice.
Yeah, absolutely, very vital question at the moment, and something that is sort of occupying a lot of our thoughts at the moment. We are, at the moment, we need to just say this is English medium assessment, but the hope is that in the very near future we are providing, in the first instance, instructions and guidance in other languages, and then ultimately we'll be looking at modifying the content to suit languages other than English. We're also doing a lot of work at the moment to ensure that the questions are culturally specific and relevant to regions. But I'm afraid at the moment everything is English language medium, but within some of our assessments we have the non-verbal reasoning. So we expect a certain level of understanding of English in order to access the material, but we do find that students who perform low down in terms of their scores in the literacy and English sections perhaps have done very well at the non-verbal sections, and that's a kind of counterbalance to that. So we understand that children and students out there have a variety of if they are English speakers, that has a variety of sort of implications. They could be incredibly fluent, or they could be ab initio learners, and the spectrum is very, very wide. And we hope the non-verbal helps to sort of address that sort of balance a little bit. But yeah, definitely as an organization we are working towards broadening out our assessments by providing various affordances for languages other than English, but that's work in progress.
Great, thank you, Mark. Okay, everyone, we're going to close the webinar now. Look out for the post-webinar communications from us, which will include the slides along with a recording of this, and ways that you can get in touch with us. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. Have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for listening.